Um, and, and welcome. My name is Vunkasor, and I am one of the program officers for community and engagement. Thank you for joining us today, especially on this Valentine's Day for our Partner With Us series. Today's topic is bridging equity and ecology, championing climate justice in the church. A few of important notes before we get started. One, this session is being recorded and the content will be posted on our Partner With Us webpage. I encourage you to share with others who couldn't be here with us today but might be interested in this topic of discussion. Two, for Q&A, feel free to put your question in the chat for our presenter to address them during or after the presentation. Okay, let's start us up with the mission. All right. Church World Service is a faith-based organization transforming communities around the globe through just and sustainable responses to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. And for our presenter today, we have Andrew Fuse. Andrew served as CWS Senior Technical Advisor for Climate and Migration. In this position, he provides guidance to CWS offices and partners around the world in designing, implementing, and evaluating projects related to climate change, including in places where climate is impacting migration and displacement. Andrew has worked with CWS for 15 years and has previously served as a technical lead for global migration, interim regional director for CWS in Africa, and as our U.S. liaison for CWS refugee resettlement processing team in Kenya. He now lives with his husband and two cats in Bronx, which is a part of the ancestral territory of the Napi people. Andrew is studying urban sustainability at the City College of New York and is an occasional parishioner at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Manhattan. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Andrew. So Andrew, please take it away. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much, Vaughn. You can hear me right? You can hear me okay? Excellent. Hi, and thanks everyone for joining. Happy Valentine's Day to all. Again, my name is Andrew. Very excited to be here with you today. I'm going to just get started by going over a few of the objectives that we have for the session today. We're looking to review key components of climate action, including mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. These are technical terms, but they mean, I think, fairly simple concepts, and I'll lift up some examples of how CWS is addressing them in our work. Learn about our efforts to promote climate resilience and a sustainable future for all. So go over what we've been doing on the ground, working together with partner communities, a few examples of what we're advocating for. And also we'll be lifting up some tools and perspectives that we hope will be useful for you in your work with congregations, in your local communities, and in terms of fostering climate justice, environmental justice. I'm just going to get started with a short icebreaker. I know we've got I think a tight-knit group here today. So I was initially not going to just share a few examples of this from my perspective, but also invite all of you to pop some thoughts into the chat, or even just raise a hand if you want to speak up. But I found one good way of getting conversations started about environment and climate is to really think through our senses, think through our five senses. How does it feel where we are? How does the environment taste to us, smell to us? What are we hearing? What are we seeing? And thinking about that in the context of where we physically are. And I've learned to ask that in terms of where are you living? Where are you working? Where do you play? Where do you worship? Where do you study? As a way of helping ourselves really ground us in the places, the physical places that we're in. So I have an example here for you. This is Coney Island, which is near where I grew up in Brooklyn. It's about 2 miles away. And for me, when I would jog down here, there was always this transition of smell. I ran down this 6-lane busy road through the middle of Brooklyn to get there. So I had the smell of car exhaust suddenly transitioned to this much fresher smell of the open air, of the ocean. And that was just such a refreshing feeling for my lungs when I was jogging as a kid. And I was thinking how to contrast that with the taste of the water when I'd go in, which when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, kind of tasted like what it tastes like if you lick a battery. I don't know if anyone as a kid ever tried tasting a battery, but it had that kind of metal taste to it. And so this was my interaction with my environment around me. As I got older and I started taking the subway to high school, taking the subway to get around, my environment included not just what was the outdoors around me, but also the indoors, the underground spaces. And so for me, part of it's thinking about as I reflect on, how do I interact with my environment? What does the air smell like, taste like underground here? What's the noise? What am I hearing here in the subway? And then we can think about this also in terms of climate and how we're perceiving climate change, how we're feeling that in our lives. What I've got here at the right is a picture that I took last June. It was during the period when there was all the smoke coming down from Canada into the Northeast and I think other parts of the US too. And I remember going to work one day at CWS's office, where we sit, for those of you who don't know our New York office, we sit overlooking the Hudson River. And so I was looking out and I couldn't see the other side of the river. And for me, it was strange because I don't remember checking the weather that morning and seeing anything for rain or any clouds. And it wasn't until I got outside later and just took in a breath and smelled the burning, smelled the smell of things burning and felt the air in my body and my lungs that I realized this probably isn't a storm. So, I check what's happening on my phone, read about the fires. So that was for me a way of I think really hitting home the impacts of how our climate is changing, how that's creating conditions that you have larger fires, more powerful fires spread, that we can smell them, from 1,000 miles away or further. And these are things that people all over the world are feeling and seeing and tasting and smelling in different ways. So I'm sharing this partly as I think, an icebreaker for us here in this session. If you're interested, you could share in the chat who you are, where you're from. If you have any thoughts on this, what maybe one way that you interact with your environment, that you feel it, smell it, taste it in your daily life. If you have any personal experiences, how you feel, smell, taste, hear, see climate change, feel free to add that in. But also come back to this to the end, as this is one of the tools that I've been learning on how to engage groups in conversation around climate and around environment, because it's a way of us grounding ourselves in our own space where we are individually, and then broadening out that from there to feel how are other people's feeling it, and how are the ways that how do we show up in our spaces? How does that affect our interaction with the environment? We can think about that as we want to lean in towards building some collective action towards justice and equity. So for CWS, we've been doing climate action for a number of years, I think. And I think the way that we would express this is that we're trying to both understand in places where we're working, what are the effects of climate change, and be able to help mitigate, reduce the damaging effects of climate change. We know that in many places where we work, our partner communities are already struggling with hunger, poverty, displacement, disaster, many times living in really difficult environments, physical environments, natural environments. So we're addressing this through our program work. We're addressing this through our partnerships, direct services in some places, through advocacy in some arenas. We're also looking more closely at how we manage our own operations and what is our own climate footprint and how we can address that as an organization. And when I say climate change, what I'm meaning here is the human impacts on our climate, on our natural environment, and particularly on our climate systems, largely through burning fossil fuels. So how is the way that we're burning fossil fuels impacting global warming? And from that, how is the warming of the land and the ocean interacting with the ice, interacting with all the living things on Earth, interacting with the soil? So these are the different parts of the climate system overall. And I think one of the top lines from last year is that not only are the land and the ocean continuing to warm, but it's really looking more and more like that we're as a species, we're not going to be able to hit the globally agreed upon targets that have been set out in the Paris Climate Agreement from 2015. And this namely was to keep global warming compared from today compared to so that's 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit for those of us in the US. And this, this isn't to say that this was a target that was supposed to be a safe point. That wasn't the purpose of this. It was to try to come up with a target that was ambitious, and that could meaningfully try to prevent too many tipping effects and too many ripple effects from global warming on the whole climate system. But even where we've been, just a couple years ago at on average 1.1 degrees Celsius above average, already that's creating dangers for people around the world. And as we're now, I think, approaching 1.5, last year was the first year that there was a daily average, so a single day that was 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It's looking more and more like we're going to pass that as an annual average. And so can the global community keep global warming to within 2 degrees Celsius, which was sort of the next bar that was named in the Paris Agreement? These are all still questions that have to be answered. It's not that at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're not facing disastrous consequences, but the scale and the magnitude of them become even more severe with not just with every degree, with every fraction of a degree of warming. And so this is the reason that transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy is really so crucial. And last year at the annual climate summit in Dubai, participating governments at least agreed to naming fossil fuels in the text, but fell really short of any sort of meaningful commitment to transitioning away from fossil fuels. So this is really still a huge and significant challenge that we face in the US and we face in many other countries that are producing and dependent on fossil fuels. And while there are other complementary actions that can take to mitigate this change, really those are just that, they're complementary. So there's efforts to try to strengthen the natural ways that the earth absorbs carbon dioxide through our water bodies, through forests, through watersheds, and efforts to try to create new technology that can help around the edges, but these are not going to replace a transition away from fossil fuels. I like to use a quote that's attributed to Mark Twain: "Climate is what we expect, weather is what we get." And that's, I think, a way to think about that in the past, climate's been something we could name as a constant. So we knew what the climate was 150 years ago in a given part of the country, given part of the world. And we might say, well, there's going to be some variation, but it'll be like this within what we expect. So maybe some years it rains a little less, some years it rains a little more. And it's been like that for almost 12,000 years through the Holocene period. I remember seeing once a graph of the temperature changes going all the way back to the different geological periods. And when you get up to before 12,000 years ago, the changes are like this, going up and down, up and down, up and down. And then you get to this one little bar that's just like a little bit of a squiggle, but mostly a straight line. And it really hit me then, just what a special period of time this period, the Holocene period, has been, where we've had such a stable environment. That's what's given birth to sedentary agriculture, been given birth to a lot of what we know as our current ways of living, the many ways that humans live around the world. And that's what's changing now. That what we could expect in the past as the averages, what would be our average weather, what would be kinds of extreme weather, that's all changing. And so we don't only have to, as part of climate action, mitigate those changes, try to stop them from getting worse, but also adapt to the changes that are taking place. So understanding what are the kinds of risks that exist, what are the kinds of changes in extreme conditions, simply what's going to be the expected environment, expected weather in a given place. In some cases, how can people try to take advantage of that? If you understand that there's going to be a 3-degree average temperature shift, maybe you don't plant some crops, you do plant different ones that might thrive better in that environment. So adaptation, trying to build now for the climate that we expect in the future, that's really the heart of the second piece of climate action. One thing we've been doing in CWS in a more intentional way, I think, over the last 4 or 5 years is really working alongside our partner communities to listen and to work together to document what people are feeling, how people are experiencing climate change in the places where they are, in the places where they work, in the places where they go to school, where they worship. I'm showing a couple pictures here from some community research that we did in 2021 in Indonesia and Cambodia. We've also done this now I think in six other countries, and are about to roll it out to a couple more countries this year. And this is something we're doing alongside providing financial support, providing some technical support for community organizing in places where people are really feeling climate impacts acutely. So it's not in place of that kind of partnership. It's something I think to be in addition to it, so that we have a way of working with our partners to better document and understand the kinds of changes, use that to inform the way that we're developing together our interactions, and see how we give voice to that, or even better, how we can position our partner communities to give voice to that in forums where policies are being decided. What we heard through the first round of community research, I think some pieces that we were expecting, and some pieces I think that maybe struck us that we hadn't been hearing until we sat down and did a more systematic listen. But certainly things like unpredictable rainfall, unpredictable seasons, and for folks who are depending on the land and the weather to plan agriculture, especially, this makes life and livelihoods even more precarious. Extreme heat in many places where we work, water scarcity, increased risk of flooding, and in some places that's in the same place. So because of the extreme heat and extreme dryness, you get the land very dry. And then if you have sudden extreme thunderstorms, rainstorms that are more extreme than in the past, the risks of flooding increase because the land's too dry to absorb the water. Impacts in agriculture, and just generally hearing that the cost of earning a living through agriculture, through raising livestock, through small business in rural areas are going up. The costs of building in protections for communities to disasters, planning for long-term changes because of the climate, these are going up, and unfortunately, even human costs in terms of lives, in terms of displacement, and these are all on top of other human-made environmental pressures. So I think this was another piece that for CWS we're trying to really tune in on, and hearing from our partners that human-made climate change is just one form of environmental injustice that people are facing. For a long time, there's been threats like deforestation, mining, other forms of pollution and resource degradation, conflict over natural resources that have already been creating pressures on people's ability to access land, access water safely, send their kids to school, earn a living, participate in civic life. And so when we think about responses that are just and equitable, we also want to bring this into view. And that's something we've been doing in partnerships around the world. Sharing here just a few examples of quotations from the first round of community research that we did. We were asking folks specifically about what they need, what they're doing, and what they need to adapt to changes where they are, and also to get a sense of whether and how people were feeling climate as a factor in migration, as a factor in migration that's for work. So in some places, people feeling the economic impacts of climate change, and that becomes a factor in whether to seek work elsewhere. In some places, as you see on I think especially this quote on the top here, the situation's feeling so dire that it sounded to at least my ears, having heard people articulate reasons for fleeing forms of persecution, the idea of something wanting to kill you. It's not facing the barrel of a gun, it's facing yet another failed harvest and no access to but still the same sense of fear that we heard. And in some places, we heard migration as part of people's lives and part of people's climate story. And so in a few of those places, we would I think characterize it as displacement, in the sense of people saying they have no other choice. They have really very little ability to stay where they are. For the most part, I think we heard definitely interest in adapting in place, though, and people telling us what they were already doing, how they're using resources that they have to adapt to the changes that are taking place. And so I think this is informing how we're thinking about the right to stay. So in a lot of our work, especially with people on the move, we're thinking about rights, we're thinking about protections and dignity for people in migration, in displacement contexts. I think we're also now, as we grapple with the impacts of climate change, trying to see how do we bring to life the right to stay and live safely and live with dignity and live with access to protections and safety in places where climate conditions are becoming increasingly harsh. The blueprint that we came up with from these intentional conversations with our partner communities includes ensuring access to water, especially in places where water scarcity is an issue, but also in places where sometimes the issue is too much water going in the wrong place, and not having access to the quality of water that you need to stay healthy. Looking at ways to make agriculture and farming more resilient to climate change. What are ways that communities can get access to different crops, to hardier seed varieties, hardier livestock varieties, access to the resources that people need to expand and diversify livelihood opportunities. More recently, looking also at what can we do that would achieve those goals and also restore the environment, also restore the ecosystems. So thinking about the impacts not only on the human terms that we definitely heard a lot of through our community conversations, but also what are the impacts on the ecological systems and the health of the environment, and how can approaches be, or how can we design approaches that help people make a living in ways that also restore environmental health in places where climate change is impacting the quantity of water, watersheds, maybe impacting the ability of the natural environment to protect people from floods, to protect people from droughts, to store water underground. Looking at women's leadership and youth engagement as critical pieces of this. Community-based approaches looking at risk reduction, at recovering from disasters. Access to information, access to technology, and thinking about that both in terms of how do communities where we're working and people have been deploying indigenous local techniques, have understanding of their natural environment, how to bring those pieces of knowledge to the attention of local governments, of local planners, and how to bring the scientific information that's being developed by universities, by government bodies, how to make sure that's accessible to farmers, how that's accessible to women who are managing water resources. We've also been looking at how to respond in places where climate is already a factor in migration, where it's already part of people's stories of displacement, of being on the move, of feeling unsafe for different reasons. A couple examples that I'll share here. One, in Cambodia, we do a lot of work along the border between Cambodia and Thailand, mostly all agricultural communities where people are feeling the impact, not just on how climate change is adding to the challenges of making a living as a farmer, but also how it's increasing family debt, and how the debt burdens that families are feeling are impacting people's choices. In many cases, we heard people, young men, young women, going to look for work across the border in Thailand, and hearing about the kinds of threats that might expose you to, both challenges in terms of making the border crossing, challenges that you face in work environments, accessing healthcare, and generally hearing from people that they would want to make a go of it in Cambodia, but here's what they need: all that list of tools and resources for adaptation that I described here. But that it would be good on in addition to that, to understand how to keep oneself safe, because migration is increasingly part of their own story, part of the story of people in their families and their communities. So we've been integrating into the work there not only support to climate resilient farming and to disaster planning, but also information around staying safe in migration. What are the protections under Cambodian law? What are some resources that you can try to access if you're in Thailand? What are strategies that people who have already migrated and returned, what would they say to others who are considering that as an option, as a way of staying safe? In the Republic of Georgia, we've been working in high mountain areas, a lot of communities where disaster risks like mudslides, landslides are very high. So thinking not only what are the risks of sudden disaster, but from hearing from communities, what are the risks of the changes in the climate and weather more generally on agriculture, and how does that double down on the risks that people are facing, and whether there's viable ways to move to other parts of the country. So there, the question that's come up is not of cross-border movement, but of internal movement. So looking at potential migration or even relocation to other parts of the country. And what we've been hearing and supporting our partners on is how to work from what's already there. So there are some experiences that people have, that the government has, in terms of supporting internal relocation, but how to actually distill what works out of that and what needs to be strengthened, so that if people are choosing to move internally as really a last resort, given the impacts of climate change on disaster risks on agriculture, how can that internal move be done safely? And how can you start over in a new place and have resources to live with dignity and restart your livelihood? So these are the kinds of I think stories that we've been hearing, and as we work more and more with communities and not only focus on the needs and the opportunities to adapt in place, but also what's the realities in terms of migration, displacement. We've been working more to connect people with advocacy opportunities in their national spheres, and also at the global level. Last year, CWS worked with a global coalition to connect our community partners with regional discussions in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Pacific, around climate change adaptation. What are the impacts on migration? What are the human rights implications for people on the move because of climate change? And even had a few of our staff and partners take part in a delegation to the UN Climate Conference and Human Rights Council meeting that happened in June last year. So this was an opportunity for people from our network in Kenya, in Paraguay, in Georgia, and other parts of the world to lift up what our communities directly feeling, and what are they looking for from their own governments, but also from the international community more broadly. I'm going to pause here, and before I get going with the second half, see if there's any questions or comments from the group. Feel free to pop questions into the chat, to raise your hand, or just unmute yourself and speak up. Going once, going twice. Okay, I'll keep moving on then. And if you do have any questions or comments, I know my colleagues Sarah and Vung are monitoring the chat, so feel free to pop them in there, and we'll be sure to bring them into the discussion. So I think that's a broad overview of what CWS has been doing through our program work. We're looking largely at how to work alongside impacted communities to be able to stay safe where people are, have the resources needed to adapt in place, to manage climate risks in place, how to help people who are already on the move be able to do so safely, how to help communities where climate is impacting migration displacement start planning for safer mobility routes, how to think about what it means to not have safe ways out, and the concern about immobility. And how to link that to some of the advocacy that's taking place in people's countries and at the global level. What we've been doing over the last few months have been a bit of a stock take to see what does that look like as a whole now. So we have, I think in some places we have more than a decade of experience working with local community partners on adaptation, locally led adaptation. What does it mean if we start putting together the pieces of the whole? And are there parts of the CWS network that we're not yet looking at quite as closely in terms of some of these climate impacts? And one of these places is in the US, where we do have our role in supporting recovery from disasters. And we are looking more intentionally now at how do we support refugees and immigrants and newcomers to become involved. But I think thinking more long term in terms of what are the slow changes that people are feeling in places where they are throughout the U.S. This is something that is a new area that we're starting to look at. What I've got here are some of a few highlights that came out from last year. The U.S. did its 5th National Climate Assessment, something the U.S. government organizes every 5 years. And this is putting together basically a state of the evidence. Here's what researchers around the country have put together. And we already have strong evidence for this happening in the U.S. So there's strong evidence that there's displacement expected. In fact, displacement already taking place in some places, both from the kinds of sudden events that climate change is making more intense, making more frequent, and also for the kinds of slow moving changes that people are experiencing already in some parts of the country and are increasingly going to experience in other parts of the country. That these are not only impacting in terms of the physical infrastructure, but also impacting on people's social networks, impacting economic opportunities, impacting mental and physical health. So a lot of the same kind of impacts are documented in this report that CWS has been hearing and documenting around the world with our partner communities. And in particular, the report notes that climate risks alongside other factors are going to increasingly impact mobility and migration here in the US. So the decisions that people have to make, ability to stay where we are, whether there's a way to move out safely and rebuild your lives, these are increasingly going to be something that's under discussion. And in fact, the current administration has put together a task force at the federal level, the first time having a federal group that's looking at climate-related relocation, looking at community-based approaches to supporting communities that have been looking at relocation as something that is a last resort action because of climate impacts. Around the world, I mentioned earlier, mitigation and adaptation as two key planks of climate action. Around the world, especially in the last, I think probably last decade, there's been an increasing attention to the harms of climate pollution and what are the kinds of costs, what are the losses that people and communities are experiencing, what's the damage that's already occurring, and thinking about this through the lens of accounting for losses, accounting for damage, what can be done to prevent future harms, but also what needs to be done to account for harms that have already taken place. Showing here one of the more extreme examples on the left, this is a photo from the Camp Fire wildfires in California a couple of years ago, where it's really striking and very immediately visible the extent of damage and the extent of loss that was incurred. And sometimes that's most visible in terms of the way we feel in economic losses or material losses, like housing, infrastructure, jobs, income. But also, there's also increasing attention globally to what are called non-economic losses. So how are people feeling harms from climate change in terms of health, in terms of losing a place to live, being displaced, including loss of biodiversity, ecosystem functions, the health of the environment, as well as the health of people who live in the environment, loss of culture, loss of our social connections, and at the most extreme, loss of life. And for countries like the US that have been a leading source of the climate pollution that's causing this whole crisis globally, I think it really lifts up an important question that those of us in the US need to think about from a standpoint of justice. What does it mean to be accountable for those harms from the standpoint of a country that's been a leading source of that pollution? What are the concerns for equity across countries? And so it's often repeated in climate action spheres. People in communities who are feeling the impacts most acutely are ones that have contributed the least climate pollution to the crisis in the first place. This is an area where CWS has been able to pull out from those community conversations and community research that we've been doing evidence of the kinds of loss and damage that people have been reporting to us. And we were able I think it was about a year and a half ago, to put that together and send it in to one of the UN special rapporteurs, the special rapporteur for climate and human rights, who is documenting this globally. And some of the evidence that we shared ended up in the report. This was one of the many pieces of efforts taking place around the world that have given more visibility to concerns of loss and damage, and led last year to the establishment of a loss and damage mechanism under the International Climate Treaty. So this means that there's now something within the international climate agreements to give governments a way to work together to address loss and damage that's already occurred, to prevent loss and damage that could occur in the future if urgent changes aren't made to the way energy is created. That alongside the existing commitments to reduce fossil fuels, eliminate fossil fuels, and transition to renewable resources to mitigate climate change, and to get resources into places where people are already adapting to climate change impacts. Thinking about what's equity across countries, I think we can also think about what are justice and equity concerns within countries and within communities. And this lets up a lot of justice concerns, I think, that I imagine you're, for those of you who are not working on climate ministries or green ministries, but maybe working on welcoming ministries, refugee and migrant ministries, other community-based efforts, you're coming across these justice and equity concerns in other areas of your ministry and other areas of your work. What not only are the ways that people are experiencing harm, how does that reflect the kinds of injustices that exist? But also what are the ways that resources are being allocated? How is that reflecting equity? As governments are making investments in climate protections, who's accessing them and who's paying for them? Within the US, we know historically from the movement for environmental justice that it's been communities of color, Black communities, Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, in many places, isolated rural communities, isolated and economically isolated urban communities that have borne the brunt of environmental harms. And so that's already been at risk of repeating and has already been repeating in terms of climate change impacts. Meanwhile, as governments invest in protections for their communities, will it repeat some of the inequities that we've seen in environmental investments, where it tends to be whiter and wealthier communities that have more access to environmental goods and environmental benefits? And I think one of the lessons here is that these two questions need to be brought together. So as we look at transitions to renewable energy, how can communities that have been bearing the brunt of pollution not just climate pollution, but air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, not only get those polluting entities out of their communities, but also have equitable access to green jobs, have equitable access to upgrades to the electric grid, to access to renewable energies, so that there's equitable benefits to the kinds of transitions that are in the works here now. And I think within CWS, one of our areas of concern, given the focus of our work, especially in the US, is cultivating leadership among newcomer communities and our community partners, giving visibility to how refugees and immigrants are already organizing to give voice to how climate change and environmental injustice more broadly is affecting them in places where they live, and being able to connect newcomers with the kinds of climate action that are taking place locally, and beyond that at state and national levels. So these are all things that have been coming out as we have been doing this internal reflection. And I think over the next, probably the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to be building out, building our plan to be doing more on this in ways that connect what we're already doing locally, nationally and globally in different parts of the world, with parts of the world where maybe we haven't yet had as much investment in local climate action, including the US. So I say that as I think for me, it's a very exciting time to be sharing this presentation, and I'll be offering and some of the suggested follow-up a way for those of you who've joined the presentation today to be part of this process. So we've already been doing stock take with our staff around the world, with folks in our advocacy teams, our refugee community organizing teams, have been digging into what we've been doing in our program work, comparing it to some of the global standards for climate action. And we'd really love to integrate also perspectives from our those of you who are working in local ministries and are involved at the congregational level, at the community level, whether it's on climate or not. So getting a sense of what you're hearing and seeing from your own vantage point. So I think with that, there are a few steps that I'll suggest that we could all take as next steps from this. One is thinking about our own personal reflection and action, but doing that in a way, not doing that in sort of a generic way, oh, I need to recycle more, but more in a very specific way to where you are. And, where I am, where am I living in my own house? I did this exercise a few months ago and was thinking about my stove and how my stove has no hood and how my kitchen window is really small and how that smell of gas that's in our kitchen all the time where I'm working, where my husband is cooking, isn't good for us. It isn't good for our health. And thinking, maybe one piece of action that I should take is to make a switch to an electric stove, because now there's a moment where there's some support available, up to $840 for rebates for switching to electric stoves, and it will be good for me and my family, I think. So that's thinking about my actual indoor air quality, my actual environment where I'm living and a lot of days working. So that gets back to the exercise that I shared at the beginning of this presentation. I think also engaging in conversations across your local ministries, engaging in other community partners. And this is in part because I recognize that we're all coming at this from different standpoints. So there'll be a benefit just from having more, I think, strength in numbers and getting a better sense of what the community as a whole is feeling and already doing. But also, I think this gives a way to start bringing in the justice and equity concerns and frames that I was naming before. So thinking intentionally about racial justice and racial equity, gender justice and equity, indigenous sovereignty, thinking about intergenerational equity in terms of who's part of that conversation, who's at the table, who's naming the agendas, who's taking and sharing responsibility for setting priorities and moving community-based efforts forward. And then finally, I think staying connected with CWS as we build out our own climate action work. I mentioned before, we're coming to, I think over the next month or two, we're going to be coming to a close of this stock take that we've been doing with our staff and partners around the world. And I'm really excited that we're going to be naming, I think, a few priorities that we didn't have before or we didn't see before in the way that we're seeing them clearly now. And one of those, I think, is how can we actually bring to bear a meaningful voice from impacted communities, and even more importantly, get folks who are being impacted into the rooms where decisions are being made about loss and damage, about adaptation funding. These are all things that we've been hearing as needs. How do we work together to have more of an impact than we can just by putting together the evidence and submitting that into the reports that are being put together, but actually to demonstrating constituency and demonstrating a powerful voice on this. So those are three next steps. I'm going to share after this session some more resources, just a few brief resources that are available online, written materials, videos that could be of use to you, could be of use to your local congregations and ministries. We'll also share, I think, these points and maybe a few short survey questions that would be, I think, from my standpoint, very helpful if you were interested. I would love to hear your responses to and get your input on how you might want to be more engaged, how your community and congregations can be more engaged. So great. Let me stop there and thank everyone for joining, and I'll turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you, Andrew, for the great and insightful presentation. Is there any question for Andrew? You are feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or drop the question in the chat. Okay, if there's no more question for Andrew, again, we will share some of the information and resources after the session, as well as this content will be posted on the web page. So please share that with others who might be interested in learning about this topic. Just a quick reminder, we will have another partner with us session that will be on March 13, I think it's on cultivating care. If there's anything else, I guess we can end our session a little bit early today. Again, thank you, Andrew, and everyone for joining us for Partner with Us series for today. Have a great Valentine's Day.